I need a haircut, something bad. My hair is just all out of shape. Been re-dyeing it myself and it needs to be freshened up. This is very faded. But anyway, speaking of, I guess I can't tie that in. I was going to say, speaking of faded, no, that doesn't work. Speaking of freshening up, well, we are finished, or we will be, with this recording of Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972. So, I'm going to go in the last few chapters, which is October through December, and the epitaph. So, starting in October, he actually took some time off, Dr. Hunter Thompson did, and basically retreated to his home and said he would get out of bed long enough to go to the polling place and vote for George McGovern. And that was it for October. He didn't write a damn thing. So then November. And he talks about how he was, and it's been a little while since I read this, so I'm trying to get my context again, but apparently tells a story about in November how he was at a bar with the whole campaign crew of McGovern and then ended up in jail after a fight. And apparently had a nervous breakdown because there's an editor's note that says, at this point, Dr. Thompson suffered a series of nervous seizures in his suite at the Seal Rock Inn. It became obvious both by the bizarre quality of his first draft work and his extremely disorganized lifestyle that the only way the book could be completed was by means of compulsory verbal composition. Despite repeated warnings from Dr. Thompson's personal physician, we determined that for aesthetic, historical, and contractual reasons, the work would have to be finished at all costs. So the editor just basically interviewed Dr. Thompson for the rest of the information they needed for this book. And this is an interesting picture you can see of him. It says Dr. Thompson at work, where he's scribbling, has a cigarette in his mouth, and is surrounded by beer. It looks like Miller Lite. So, he's telling a story about the two planes, the two campaign planes that went around for the McGovern campaign. And one of them was called the Zoo plane, which was occupied by the media. And contrary to what most people would think, they actually had to pay, or their employers did, for each of those flights. This wasn't provided by the campaign. And he was just talking about the massive amount of drugs there was on the Zoo plane. And a few McGovern staffers tried to get on the Zoo plane, but the press pretty much had it nailed down. And Hunter said, you have to remember that every member of the press who traveled on either one of the planes, any campaign plane, was billed at the first class rate plus 1/3, and the 1/3 was to pay for damages. And he says Gary Hart admitted that he had known McGovern would lose for about a month before the election, because basically the whole Eagleton thing. Dr. Thompson said his whole image of being first a maverick anti-politician and then suddenly becoming an expedient pragmatic hack who talked like any politician Well, he began talking like a used car salesman, sort of out of both sides of his mouth in the eyes of the public. Then he was no longer a maverick or an anti-politician. He was no better than Hubert Humphrey, and that's how he was perceived. He said, perceive is the word that became in the 72 campaign what charisma was for the 1960, 64, and 68 campaigns. Perceive is the new key word. The Eagleton affair was the first serious crack in McGovern's image as the anti-politician. He dumped Eagleton for reasons that he still won't talk about. Eagleton's mental state was much worse than was ever explained publicly. How much worse, it's hard to say right now. But there was no hope of keeping Eagleton on that ticket. The Eagleton thing is worth looking at for a second in terms of the difference between perception and reality. McGovern was perceived as a cold-hearted political pragmatist who dumped this poor, neurotic, good guy from Missouri because he thought people wouldn't vote for him because they were afraid that shock treatments in the past might have some kind of lingering effect in his mind. Whereas, in fact, despite denials of the McGovern staff in the last days of the campaign, when I was one of the 5 or 6 reporters who were pushing very aggressively to find out more about Eagleton and the real nature of his mental state, I spent about 10 days in late September, early October in St. Louis trying to dig up Eagleton's medical record out of Barnes Hospital, or actually the Renard Hospital in the Washington University Medical Center. Despite this, Mankiewicz denied knowing anything about it because he promised to protect the person who told him about it in the first place. But basically, there's something you should know about Tom Eagleton. He's a dangerous nut. And he said he wasn't the wronged good guy. He was an opportunistic liar with a history of very serious mental disorders and no reason for anyone to believe they wouldn't recur. So the editor tried to summarize. So the difference between the perception and the reality was that the public saw McGovern dumping Eagleton for political expedience when in reality there was no way Eagleton could stay on the ticket. He had deceived McGovern, and Mankiewicz was attempting to break this in the most favorable way, but failed, and Hunter said right. Eagleton never showed McGovern his medical records. He kept saying he would bring them to South Dakota, but didn't. And he said Eleanor McGovern was the first person to advise dumping Eagleton. She wanted to dump him in Miami about 2 minutes after she heard he'd been selected to be on the ticket. She was the only person in Miami who was openly, out front, opposed to Eagleton right from the start. Except me, of course. But people like Hart and Mankiewicz never took my opinions very seriously. That was Dr. Thompson talking. So the editor asks, one last question about this trip from Long Beach to Sioux Falls. Why was this second plane called the Zoo plane? And how widespread was the use of dangerous narcotics in the campaign and on this trip? Dr. Thompson, well, let's first deal with the fact that drugs are not necessarily narcotics. Coffee is a drug. Yes, there were drugs being used. Booze is a drug. Many drugs. They're all around us these days. I've been studying drugs for years. He continued, I make a point of knowing what I'm putting in myself. Wise man. McGovern places a large part of the blame for his defeat on the press. He did it before the election, and even now he's still doing it. The Eagleton affair turned him brutally against the press. He thought they were crucifying him and leaving Nixon alone, and he was right on one level. But what he ignored was the fact that first, he was out in the open and committing these blunders that the press couldn't ignore. while Nixon was not out in the open and committing no blunders, or at least none that the press could pin on him. And the rest, a lot talks about, obviously he didn't handle coming off the campaign very well. I'm talking about Dr. Thompson. He was a wreck. And there's quite a bit talking about how hard it was to come off the lifestyle of being on a campaign, that it was so different to be back in like private life. And he noted, the mood of the nation in '72 was so overwhelmingly vengeful, greedy, bigoted, and blindly reactionary that no presidential candidate who even faintly reminded, quote-unquote, typical voters of the fear and anxiety they felt during the constant social upheavals of the '60s had any chance at all of winning. He did get to speak with McGovern a bit after the campaign, but a lot of it is rehashing things we already discussed about. But McGovern did admit that he thinks we exaggerated the amount of enthusiasm for change among young people, and that he was running a '60s campaign in the '70s, and that was part of the problem. And then back to the interview with the editor. It said the Eagleton affair was so damaging to McGovern's image, not as a humane, decent, kind, conservative man who wanted to end the war, but as a person who couldn't get those things done even if he wanted to. He was perceived then as a dingbat, not as a flaming radical. A lot of people seemed to think that was one of the images that hurt him. But according to Pat, that radical image didn't hurt him at all. The same conclusion appeared in a Washington Post survey that David Broder and Haynes Johnson did. They agreed that the Eagleton affair was almost immeasurably damaging, and according to Gary Hart, it was so damaging as to be fatal. They understood this by mid-September. And then Hunter goes on to talk about perhaps his own future political plans and his hopes for the future of the country. And he ran actually a pretty radical campaign in Aspen, and he had a set of stocks built for bad drug dealers. And he talked about the excitement of running on a truly radical platform. He's obviously much more to the left than I am, but I can understand that. But he closed with a poignant statement about how somebody with truly radical ideas isn't really going to get anywhere. But the energy of the campaign would be so fantastic. And he ends with, but you'd be killed, of course. And that would add to it considerably, never knowing when the bullet was coming. And that is it for Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. I learned a lot in this book, but did I like it? A lot of people really loved this writing style. It was too disorganized and frenetic for me, though it did give you the mood of it, of being actually on the campaign trail. So I would say, a C, It wasn't bad, it wasn't fantastic, but it was educational, and sometimes when you're learning for history's sake, that's about all that can be asked. In a separate video, I'll talk about the next book we're going to do. It was going to be Radicals for Capitalism. I'm putting that aside in favor of something a little bit more timely, I think, for the time period we're dealing with. Talk about that in a separate video.